A young woman who had just recently graduated from high school and started her first job set off to another city for a work seminar, but she never reached her destination. Soon, police joined the search, and investigators began uncovering one clue after another. They quickly realized that something truly terrible might have happened to the young woman, but solving this case proved far more difficult than it seemed at first glance. It was only nearly 3 decades later that they finally managed to close the book on this investigation. But its outcome turned out to be completely different from what anyone expected to see. Berit Beck was born on April 12th in the small American town of Sturtevant, Wisconsin. It was a quiet and peaceful place where, according to the residents themselves, no significant events ever occurred, neither good nor bad. The town was distinguished by its measured pace of life, low crime rate, and popularity among families with children. Berit lived there with her parents and younger brother, studied at the local school, and had many friends. One of the main passions in her life was music. The girl was a member of her school orchestra, where she played the violin. In high school, Berit began dating a guy named Kurt, and their relationship continued after graduation. At the time of her graduation in the summer of 1990, Berit was 18, and she was reflecting on her future plans. The girl intended to go to college, but had not yet decided on a profession. She considered various options, but they were all united by the fact that they were somehow connected to music. In addition to this, Berit took a job to save up money before entering college. She received a position in the office of a fairly large company, and in July of that year, she was scheduled to attend a 3-day seminar where employees were trained in computer work. For Berit, this was quite a serious step. The girl, who had graduated from school only a few weeks ago, needed to travel to another city located several hundred miles from her home. At first, her parents reacted to this trip rather skeptically. They worried about their daughter, who had to cover such a distance alone and spend several days in an unfamiliar city. But in the end, they accepted it, since Berit was already an adult and the seminar was necessary for her work. On the morning of July 17th, they gave her the family van, helped her pack her things for the road, and the girl set off. She promised to call them as soon as she checked into the hotel. However, time passed, and Berit did not make contact. Her parents, who were already worried about their daughter, began to worry even more, since the road to that city should have taken only a few hours. Toward evening, the parents called the hotel and found out that the girl had never checked into her room. They also called her colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. None of them had seen Berit that day. Despite all this, the parents held on to hope that everything was fine with their daughter. They assumed the girl might have changed plans and checked into another hotel or stayed with someone she knew. For this reason, they decided to wait until morning. But when her work seminar began and Berit did not appear there, the parents decided to contact the police. Officers joined the search. However, initially they limited themselves to sending out an alert for her vehicle. The girl was a legal adult, and the police had no evidence that she could have become a victim of a crime, so they did not launch a full-scale search operation. Throughout the entire day, Berit never made contact with her parents and did not appear at the work seminar. Police also failed to locate her vehicle or any clues whatsoever. The next day also brought no news. However, everything changed on July 19th. The police received a report about a similar van parked at a supermarket in the small town of West Bend, 60 miles from Berit's home. Officers immediately established that this vehicle belonged to the girl's family and proceeded to examine it. The van doors turned out to be locked, and Berit herself was not inside. First of all, police found a receipt from a pharmacy located across the street from the parking lot. It was issued during the day on July 17th, the day of the girl's disappearance. A pharmacy employee confirmed that the girl had indeed come in around noon. She was alone, in a good mood, and nothing in her behavior aroused suspicion. The car was also missing a radar detector and the radio, which pointed to a possible robbery. However, further study of the van brought more questions than answers. There was quite a lot of cigarette ash in the car's cabin. Considering that Berit had never smoked in her life, someone else must have been in the van. And judging by the amount of ash, they spent quite a lot of time there. Another strange fact was that practically all of the girl's belongings were still lying in the van. Her red shirt, in which she left home, was lying on the floor, and a piece of fabric had been torn from it. The dress she intended to wear to the seminar was also lying nearby, and her stockings were tied in a knot. The boots in which the girl left home were also in the van. In addition to all this, the police noticed another strange point. Before the parents gave Berit their van, they wrote down the mileage, since the girl's company was supposed to cover all travel expenses. After checking the data, they realized that the odometer had added an extra 460 miles. Considering that it was only 60 miles from Berit's home to this parking lot, Someone must have driven the car a much greater distance before abandoning it in front of the supermarket. Another fact pointing to the presence of another person in the van was several paper coffee cups, one from McDonald's, the second from Burger King. Considering that Berit apparently drove only about 60 miles before something happened to her, detectives doubted she had time to stop at 2 different places for coffee. All these facts led investigators to the thought that Berit could have become a victim of abduction, or her van was simply stolen. However, the second version turned out to be unlikely, since the girl had not been in touch for several days and her whereabouts remained unknown. Police tried to recreate the chronology of events of that day and understand her route. First, they found out that the girl did not hit the road immediately after leaving home. First, she stopped by her boyfriend, Kurt. The young man said that they talked for some time, discussed her upcoming trip to the seminar, after which Berit left. Since then, he had not contacted her, and the police found no evidence that he could have had any relation to her disappearance. However, investigators did learn one interesting fact. Kurt gave her a rather expensive ring. The girl never took it off, yet experts who studied the van found this ring under one of the floor mats. Its location suggested that someone placed the ring there on purpose, as it was quite difficult to imagine how it could fly off a finger and get under the rug. If we assume that an unknown criminal removed the ring from the girl, another question arose. Why did he take the radar and radio, but leave an expensive piece of jewelry? Meanwhile, forensics finished a detailed analysis of the van and found dozens of different fingerprints in it. Police asked all of Berit's friends and relatives to provide their prints to exclude them from this list. And in the end, they were left with several unidentified prints. On a coffee cup, on the inside of one of the windows, and on boxes of cosmetics that Berit bought at the pharmacy. Nevertheless, without suspects, these prints in no way brought investigators closer to solving the case. While police tried to discover new clues, the girl's relatives organized massive searches. They attracted more than 100 volunteers, gave interviews to local TV channels, and went to comb through hundreds of miles of the route along which their daughter was supposed to drive. In addition to this, they raised $75,000, which was offered as a reward for information about Berit's whereabouts. In the following weeks, investigators received a number of tips, but none of them brought them closer to solving this mystery. This continued for more than a month, until, on August 22nd, a call came into the police. A local farmer was driving along a rural road about 18 miles from where Berit's van was found. He noticed something strange in a ditch next to the roadside and decided to stop to take a closer look. To his horror, the man realized that human remains were in front of him and immediately reported this to the police. Officers confirmed that these were indeed the remains of a woman, but due to the high degree of decomposition, it was impossible to visually establish her identity. However, detectives immediately assumed that the deceased could be Berit, and a comparison with her dental records confirmed this version. Due to decomposition, medical experts were also unable to find any obvious injuries that could indicate the cause of the tragedy. They only assumed that the victim might have passed away from asphyxiation. But one thing was clear for sure: the police were dealing with a crime. Besides obvious facts pointing to this version, there was something else. On the victim's head was a piece of fabric from her shirt, tied like a blindfold. This led to the thought that the girl was indeed abducted and held alive for some time. However, it was most likely only a matter of a few hours, since, according to the medical examiner's report, the remains had lain next to this road for more than a month. Thus, the police assumed that the criminal ended her life on the day of the abduction. Nevertheless, the discovery of the remains brought investigators no new clues, and since then, there was no movement in this case. For months, police considered various suspects and tried to find new evidence, but all this led to a dead end. According to investigators, Berit became a victim of a robbery that did not go according to plan. They assumed that when the girl stopped near the shopping center and went to the pharmacy, someone climbed into her van. Perhaps this person planned to steal only valuables, but Berit returned too early and caught him in the car. Then he made the decision to abduct her, after which he ended her life and left the remains in that ditch. At the same time, based on the odometer readings, the criminal drove the van for some time, racking up almost 500 miles. Considering that robbery was considered as the main motive, police began to look closely at those who were engaged in similar businesses in that area. Soon, their attention was attracted by a man named Craig, who was suspected of a series of car thefts not far from that very shopping center. In addition, the criminal often used stolen cars to commit other offenses and also drove them for some time, which fell under the actions of the person responsible for Berit's tragedy. Detectives began to study Craig's possible involvement and found out that shortly after Berit's disappearance, he was arrested for armed bank robbery. Having studied the materials of this case, police found out that during the arrest, the man had a bag with him, in which, among other things, lay a woman's hairbrush with blonde hair. However, in those years, experts could not yet conduct DNA analysis and compare the hair with the genetic sample of the victim, so the police could not establish an unconditional match. Nevertheless, they learned that Craig theoretically had the opportunity to commit this crime, but this also did not prove his guilt. Soon, detectives received a new clue that radically changed the course of this case. Police interviewed several of Craig's friends, and one of them suddenly stated that the man confessed to him about ending Berit's life. Moreover, he allegedly showed him the girl's remains in her van before getting rid of them. All this forced detectives to seriously consider Craig as the main suspect. However, there was one problem. His fingerprints did not match those found inside the van. He himself also refused to admit his guilt, and investigators began to think about how to prove his involvement. In the following months, they tried to find new evidence, but this led to nothing. Police considered the possibility of bringing official charges against him, hoping that the testimony of Craig's acquaintance would be enough for a guilty verdict. But in the end, they realized that without any weighty evidence, the prosecution would simply have no chance in court. Despite this, Craig remained the main suspect in this case, and in subsequent years, detectives did not abandon attempts to find proof of his guilt. However, there was practically no movement in this case, and the investigation effectively froze for several decades. This continued until 2013, when this case was transferred to the cold case team for re-examination. When detectives began to study the materials and available evidence, a very unpleasant surprise awaited them. Practically all of Berit's clothing was missing from the warehouse. Although it was listed among the documents, the police could never find these items. Apparently, one of the officers accidentally threw away all these objects. Despite this, investigators still sent all remaining evidence to the laboratory for reanalysis, and also requested a fresh comparison of existing fingerprints. To the surprise of the police, they found out that in the 23 years since the tragedy, these prints had never been entered into digital databases, and they were still stored on paper. Soon, the lead detective received a call from the laboratory. Experts reported that after uploading the prints to the database, 5 of them showed a match with prints already available there. They belonged to a man named Dennis Brantner. Police immediately established that this name had never figured in the case files. At the same time, he had a criminal history, as a result of which his fingerprints got into the database. In his youth, Dennis received a prison term for car theft and was later arrested for breaking into someone else's house. In addition, the man once sneaked into a hotel room where a woman unknown to him lived, stole her underwear, and left notes with obscene content. Another episode seemed quite important to detectives in the context of the Berit case. Once, Dennis climbed into his ex-wife's car while she was at work and began waiting for her. When she got into the car, the man took out a weapon and tried to abduct her. However, the woman managed to escape. Detectives began to study this person and found out that during the years of the tragedy, he worked as a truck driver in that county and constantly traveled between hundreds of settlements. This gave him a hypothetical opportunity to meet the girl. Police still did not rush to conclusions. First, they made sure that Dennis was not acquainted with the girl or anyone from her family, which, in theory, could be an explanation for the presence of his fingerprints in their family van. However, one important point contradicted this version. One of Dennis's fingerprints was found on the box of cosmetics that Berit bought just a few minutes before her disappearance. This meant that the man was in the van at that very moment and strengthened suspicion toward him. Investigators decided to talk to him and headed to his home. Dennis immediately began to deny any involvement in the tragedy and insisted that he had never met Berit. But when the police told him that his fingerprints were found in her van, the man began to get very nervous and at some moments even cried answering their questions. But despite this, he continued to insist on his own. Therefore, detectives again focused on finding additional clues. Having interviewed Dennis's acquaintances, they learned several interesting points at once. His ex-wife said that the man loved Burger King and constantly ate there. Berit, on the contrary, preferred McDonald's. And as we remember, coffee cups from both establishments were found in her van. At the same time, Dennis's fingerprint was on the cup from Burger King. Then, investigators talked to former colleagues of the man, and here an even more interesting discovery awaited them. After the tragedy with Berit, Dennis worked at a factory for some time. 3 of his colleagues told detectives that at that time, the man kept a photo of some young girl with blonde hair in his tool chest. Unfortunately, after all these years, it was impossible to establish if it was Berit, but colleagues said the girl really looked like that photo. Another former colleague of Dennis said that once the man directly stated that he wanted to abduct her and subject her to violence. While police were collecting all this information, they also received news from the laboratory. Despite the fact that officers had lost part of Berit's things in the past, there were still quite a few items from her car in the warehouse, including a wrapper from a cigarette pack. Having studied it using modern instruments, forensic scientists found a new fingerprint on it, which also belonged to Dennis. Collecting all this information and evidence took almost a year, and in March 2015, the man was arrested on charges of causing the tragedy. However, there was one significant problem here. Despite the presence of Dennis's fingerprints in the victim's car, the prosecution feared that this might not be enough. The problem was that by 2015, everyone was already used to DNA, and fingerprints seemed much less reliable confirmation of guilt. If the suspect's DNA on the victim's body was practically unconditional evidence of involvement, then fingerprints in the car interior could theoretically have been left under other circumstances, and they did not indicate a direct link of the suspect to the tragedy. Despite all the efforts of experts, they never managed to find a single sample of Dennis's DNA on the things or in the victim's car, not to mention her remains. Nevertheless, this case was still transferred to court, and the process began in the summer of 2016. Dennis's lawyer latched onto the fact that the prosecution had no direct evidence of his client's guilt, and in the end, he managed to sow doubt among the jury. As a result, they could not come to a unanimous decision, and the process was declared a mistrial. The prosecution immediately announced that it would prepare for a second trial. For Berit's relatives, what was happening became a serious test. For 26 years, they had no idea what happened to the girl, and now they had to watch as the person whom the police unequivocally considered guilty avoided punishment. The second trial was scheduled for the beginning of 2018, and here certain difficulties arose again. According to the prosecution, Dennis attacked the victim with the aim of severe assault and subsequent tragedy. However, proving the existence of such intentions in the suspect was even more difficult. Considering that the possible punishment depended on this, the prosecution faced an extremely difficult task. If they could not convince the jury to find him guilty, then the man could no longer be tried for this crime again, and he could go free. After long deliberations and discussions with Berit's relatives, the prosecution came to a painful compromise. They decided to offer Dennis a deal under which he had to plead guilty to second-degree reckless homicide. Such a step guaranteed that the criminal would go behind bars, albeit for a much shorter term, and the case would be solved after 28 long years. Having consulted with a lawyer, Dennis accepted this proposal, and he was sentenced to the maximum possible term under this article, 10 years in prison. At the same time, the years he had been in prison since his arrest were counted toward the term. As a result, since he had already served a significant part, he could be released at the age of 67. The victim's parents, for obvious reasons, were frustrated by such a lenient sentence. However, they understood that in the event of refusing the deal, there was a very high probability that Dennis would avoid even such punishment. For this reason, they supported the deal proposal, fearing to miss the only chance to bring the perpetrator to justice. In memory of Berit, they also established a scholarship at her high school, which was given for success in music, and it is still active to this day. It is also worth noting that several decades later, police managed to refute the testimony against Craig, the first suspect in this case. As we remember, one of his acquaintances said that Craig showed him Berit's remains in her van, but this turned out to be a lie. In reality, this person wanted to settle a score with Craig, so he used information he heard from the police to frame him. Share your opinion about this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video. Thanks for watching.